The Holy Gospel according to Matthew.
Glory to you, O Lord.
The same day, some Sadducees came to him, saying there is no resurrection. And they asked him a question, saying, "Teacher, Moses said, if a man dies childless, his brother shall marry the widow and raise up children for his brother. Now there were 7 brothers among us. The first married and died childless, leaving the widow to his brother. The second did the same, so also the third, down to the 7th. Last of all, the woman herself died. In the resurrection, then, whose wife of the 7 will she be? For all of them had married her." Jesus answered them, "You are wrong, because you know neither the scriptures nor the power of God. For in the resurrection, they neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like angels in heaven. And as for the resurrection of the dead, have you not read what was said to you by God? I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is God not of the dead, but of the living." And when the crowd heard it, they were astounded at his teaching. The Gospel of the Lord.
Praise to you, O Christ.
Our readings for today have a clear theme of death and then new life, right? Fitting with the liturgical theme of Lent. And yet, when I read these texts, there's something that I can't quite get past, and that is, in both texts, divine wrath and suffering. And in both texts, I want to suggest that there's something else that we should pay attention to other than this death and new life, and that is that these are a political theology. We meet Jeremiah at a moment of escalation in his ministry. The Babylonians, led by Nebuchadnezzar, are sieging Jerusalem in what will lead to the fall of Judah and the destruction of Solomon's temple. Unlike Moses, who proclaimed and led God's people out of slavery and into the promised land, Jeremiah announces their impending exile from the land and God's presence from them. Jeremiah's message is not a popular one. He calls out the idolatry and disobedience of God's people, reflected in the presence of altars to foreign gods in the temple. The result of this disobedience is catastrophic. God, via Jeremiah, promises to hand over Jerusalem to Nebuchadnezzar's army, and to do so by pretty dreadful means. Through the violence of the sword and bloodshed at the hands of Babylonian soldiers, through famine and starvation, presumably as the people take refuge within the walls of Jerusalem and away from the sustenance of the land, and through pestilence, the spread of disease that would have occurred as a result of coexistence of dead and dying bodies alongside of the living. The timing of Jeremiah's message is not exactly what we would call emotionally intelligent either. Announced as it was as the siege and impending doom was already underway. Jeremiah's message also got him into trouble. You see, it was not just the people who heard his message, but it was also King Zedekiah, son of Josiah, the last of the so-called faithful kings of Judah. Jeremiah was not just calling for Zedekiah's downfall as an act of protest, but was actually announcing it as though it were already so. Jeremiah appeared to be waging a psychological battle that undermined Zedekiah's power before his own people. To tie Jeremiah's tongue, Zedekiah locked Jeremiah up. He put him in jail inside of his court. You see, God's wrath was not just directed at an unfaithful people here, but at the political authority who led them astray. A few chapters earlier, at the start of Zedekiah's reign, we see God come to both Jeremiah and Zedekiah. God's message is consistent. I have given this land over to Nebuchadnezzar. Submit yourself and your people to him, and you and your people may remain in this land." God's instruction to Zedekiah was one of humility and service, to humble himself and to give up his position for the good of God's people, the people Zedekiah, as king of Judah, was meant to serve. God had the good of God's people in view. God wanted them to remain in the land and advised Zedekiah to submit himself and his people to Nebuchadnezzar to avoid the catastrophes of war. What first appears as divine wrath is in fact the reality of political power and conflict. The sword, famine, and pestilence befalling God's people at the hands of Nebuchadnezzar as we enter this scene with Jeremiah was avoidable. It resulted from a leader who put his own power and privilege above the good of his people. Our other two passages for today, the psalm included in that, present us with alternative models of leadership for God's people. In David, we see a leader calling out to God in his moment of need. "Show me the way I should go," David says, "for to you I entrust my life. Rescue me from my enemies, Lord, for I hide myself in you. Listen to my cry for mercy. In your faithfulness and righteousness, come to my relief. Teach me to do your will, for you are my God." Unlike Zedekiah, who had God's direct instruction and disobeyed it to preserve his own position and power, David is attuned to his lowly place before God. It's not David's will that is to be done, but God's. It's not David's powerful army that will protect him, but God. In contrast to Zedekiah, we see in David a reliance on God's providence and faithful ways in the world, and a willingness to subject himself and his power to God's will without mention of David's own priorities. So now to Jesus and the gospel reading. So in this passage in Matthew, we meet Jesus shortly after his triumphal entry into Jerusalem atop a donkey. Matthew sets the scene in political terms. This was done to fulfill what had been spoken through the prophet, saying, "Tell the daughter of Zion, look, your king is coming to you, humble and mounted on a donkey." In the days since the triumphal entry, Jesus has been bombarded with questions and challenges from Pharisees, Sadducees, and the like, meant to catch him up. In the passage in question for today, we see Sadducees coming to Jesus with a question about resurrection. Who gets to own this woman as his wife in heaven when she's been passed as inheritance through 7 brothers? Jesus' response deflects the political connotation of their question, a question about inheritance rules under Mosaic law. A question about eternal life veils a question about a political statute enacted and enforced through political rule. Jesus' response throws this political question out the window. Marriage doesn't exist in heaven because God is the God of the living, not the dead. The connection back to David, and in contrast to Zedekiah, appears to be the operative orientation that elevates the divine will over political rule, embedded as it is in this message about the resurrection. But I'm going to challenge Jesus here, which I know is kind of a dangerous thing. Jesus' response challenges us in yet another way that actually places him closer to Zedekiah. The reason is Jesus' response appears to dismiss the temporal life in favor of the eschatological one, and temporal suffering in light of eternal peace. You see, the Sadducees describe what had to be a horrible experience for this poor woman, passed through inheritance laws between 7 brothers. Her existence is reduced more to property than personhood. We're told that each of her husbands died childless, which I'm guessing, given the historical context, and that it's even worth mentioning in the text was not for want of trying. Did she want to bear the children of these 7 brothers? Did she want to participate in the acts that would lead her life to motherhood of their children? We don't know. The text doesn't tell us. Instead, her existence is constructed through 2 things: her proximity to a number of husbands, construed as right of property, and her lack of child, her barrenness, her failure to fulfill her existential purpose. Her identity is narrowed to wife and mother, and yet these are ambiguous and unfulfilled in her. In this Greco-Roman world, imagine what a heavy burden that must have been to carry. Yet we don't see Jesus address this suffering, at least not directly. Instead, he seems to dismiss the question out of hand. There is no marriage in heaven. God is the God of the living, not the dead. In one respect, this response liberates the woman from the social identities forced upon her, and which life had failed to fulfill for her. So in that sense, perhaps this response restores her to full personhood without regard to the ways she is defined through her relationship to others. And yet, that's eschatological. Doesn't the suffering that she experiences in the temporal life warrant attention? Warrant correction? In this regard, Jesus' response leaves something to be desired. Depicted through the literary construct of the triumphal entry, Jesus here is construed as a political leader who appears undeterred from his eschatological vision by the temporal suffering of his female subject. So, what are the lessons here? Probably a lot, but there are 2 that I see that I want to kind of call out. First is the obvious one about leadership. Power is not given to serve the self, but to serve others. Zedekiah shows us that our work for the good of others sometimes requires that we give up our own power, give up our own position, to ensure those we serve are protected from harms that we might bring to them. Other times, service to the good of others requires us to retain our position of power, but to do so with humility, with an openness to do the uncomfortable, to follow the path of God's justice, or to stand up to prevailing norms that harm and diminish people. The second is, I think, a warning against political quietism. Political quietism is a philosophical term that describes passivity and acceptance of political rule, no matter how unjust. Inherent in this quietism is a suppression of one's own inner questioning or opposition to a political leader or tenets of their rule. Political quietism is often religiously motivated and perpetuated. We use logic like God appoints political leaders, therefore political leaders are to be accepted and unquestioned. Luther's view of political authority bore the hallmarks of political quietism. Disseminated through the Lutheran confessional culture in Germany and reinforced and justified by Nazi theologians, political quietism is thought to be one of the internalized psychological dispositions of German society that allowed Hitler and his pogrom against the Jews to go largely unchallenged. Political quietism is also on the rise again as we watch the emergence into the open of Christian nationalism and the justification of unjust rule in God's name. Here, Jeremiah, Zedekiah, David, and Jesus challenge the thrust of political quietism. They challenge this narrative of death and then new life through both positive and negative examples, charging us to attend to the here and now, to the present suffering, and to stand up for the needs of the oppressed and the good of a larger society as central to God's will and our vocation.